Welcome, everybody. Welcome. I'm Cheryl Milne. I am the Executive Director of the David Asper Centre for Constitutional Rights here at the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. I want to thank the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and the Canadian Labour Congress for suggesting that we collaborate on this wonderful event today. And I hope that I'm pleased with the turnout on a summer night at the law school. It's very unusual to have this many people come out. So it is part of the reflection of the time that we have right now. And in fact, it's a year ago that the G20 Summit took place here in Toronto. And for those of us who are Torontonians, will recall the event sometime with quite a bit of chagrin, I think, in terms of what happened. I'm going to introduce our moderator, and he will introduce our panelists. We have one panelist who is almost here, so we're going to start, and she will arrive in a few minutes. So Bob Hepburn, who's sitting in our center chair, as a Toronto Star columnist, was the Star's editorial page editor from 2002 to 2008. Before that, he was the Star's national editor and its foreign editor. He is an award-winning reporter who served for nearly 6 years as the Star's Middle East bureau chief, based in Jerusalem, and 4 years as its Washington bureau chief. He has reported from more than 40 countries for the Star. Prior to moving to Washington, he spent 6 years in Ottawa for the Star, including 4 years as its parliamentary bureau chief. He has covered 6 Canadian prime ministers and 2 American presidents. And I'm going to turn it over to his able moderation.
Thank you. When I was in the Middle East, I got used to covering, I'll call them riots, and I didn't think I would see one about a block or two from where I worked in Toronto. 1 year after the G20 Summit, almost to the day, the city is still scarred by the events of that June 26th, 27th weekend, from the innocent bystanders who were arrested and never charged, to our police force, whose reputation was severely damaged, and to the businesses, many of whom still wait for compensation. Add to that Toronto's international reputation, which was sullied by images of police cars burning in the heart of our city as rioters smashed shop windows and security forces beat innocent demonstrators and fired rubber bullets into crowds. And through it all, no one in power has accepted responsibility for the fiasco that was unleashed in Toronto, and no one in power has ordered a full inquiry into the events of that nightmarish weekend. Not my problem seems to be everyone's response. That attitude rightly upsets many people in Toronto, who witnessed the largest ever police presence in the streets of this city, in the streets of this country, and the unprecedented mass arrest of peaceful protesters and onlookers. It's an attitude that should upset everyone in this city. And the reasons are obvious. There's been no royal commission, no leader has stepped forward to accept responsibility, no official apologies, into the no official investigation into the questionable spending of the $1 billion plus, no probe into the failure of senior police commanders to control their officers, no review of the ineffectual police oversight boards, no look into the police code of silence that was evident when the Star, not fellow officers, identified those police officers who've now been charged with assaulting protesters. And 1 year later, the G20 is still making news. This Monday, the Ontario Attorney General's office released statistics showing that more than 1,100 people were detained during the summit. 317 were charged, but only 24 people have been convicted so far. On Tuesday, Dalton McGuinty again rejected any thought of a full provincial inquiry. Instead, He said it's up to Stephen Harper, to call for such a probe because the summit was a federal government initiative. Also on Tuesday, Ontario Ombudsman Andre Morin said that secrecy within the provincial government has been growing for years and culminated with the granddaddy of all secret maneuvers during the summit, which was the non-publication of a provincial regulation which extended extraordinary, likely illegal powers to the police during the summit. And just today, this afternoon at 5 o'clock, the Toronto Police Department released a 70-page internal report that says that the Toronto Police were overwhelmed and unprepared for the protesters. It outlines deficiencies, including interpretation of law, organization, and processing of the detainees. Like a banana republic is how Clayton Ruby, one of our speakers this evening, has described our inability to get answers a full year after this summit. Since the summit ended, there have been more than half a dozen small reviews by police and government agencies and boards into specific aspects of the summit, but none of these reviews has the mandate of conducting an overall probe into all facets of the summit, from how the money was spent to who planned it. Without a comprehensive inquiry, many people say, we may never be able to put all the pieces together and learn from all of the mistakes. And yet, public opinion polls taken in the aftermath of the summit indicate that an overwhelming majority of Toronto residents still support our police. And I suspect, given the emails and the phone calls that I have received personally since the G20, including today, that many people believe the police should have acted even more forcefully than they did against the violent, not the peaceful, protesters. So this evening, we want to have a conversation about the summit, the lessons learned, the messages lost, a conversation about accountability, public order policing, and the true messaging that was lost amid this summit. And for that, we have 4 distinguished speakers. Now, each is going to speak for about 10 minutes. We'll keep a monitor on them. And then we'll take questions from the audience. And there's a microphone over here, and there's a handheld mic. And so when it comes time for your questions, please keep them short. They're questions, not another speech. Our speakers are, in the order that they will be speaking, John Sewell. John Sewell has been engaged in city politics in Toronto since the 1960s in a variety of modes. As a community organizer, city councillor, mayor, journalist, activist, writer, housing administrator, and social entrepreneur. He has written a number of books and addressed audiences across Canada and in the United States on a range of local government issues. Mr. Sewell was appointed to the Order of Canada in 2005. He is currently a member of the Toronto Police Accountability Coalition and a close watcher of the Toronto Police Services Board. Barbara Byers, who just flew in from Ottawa and got stuck in Toronto traffic and is substituting for the advertised speaker who is involved in postal negotiations. Barbara Byers is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Labour Congress. She has a long history of involvement in the Canadian labour movement and held executive positions with both the Saskatchewan Government Employees Union and the Saskatchewan Federation of Labour before being elected as a CLC Executive Vice President. Barbara was a social worker for 17 years, addressing the issues of poverty, youth unemployment, Aboriginal concerns, and labour rights. She has also been a highly active union leader on the international arena. She represents Canada as one of 14 worker delegates on the governing body of the International Labour Organization, the United Nations agency that brings together governments, employers, and workers in a common action to promote decent work throughout the world. Megan Daniel is a lawyer at Falconer Charney practicing in civil, constitutional, and Aboriginal law litigation with a particular focus on state accountability. She is a former clerk of the Ontario Superior Court of Justice and a graduate of Robson Hall Law School at the University of Manitoba. Megan was one of the 1,105 people arrested and detained at that temporary Eastern Avenue Detention Centre in downtown Toronto before being released, as most of them were, without charge. And Clayton Ruby, who I referred to earlier, is one of Canada's leading lawyers specializing in criminal, constitutional, administrative, and civil rights law. He has devoted his professional career to ensuring that those who are underprivileged and those who face discrimination are given equal access to the legal system of this country. Mr. Ruby has served as a bencher of the Law Society of Upper Canada since 1977 and is also a member of the Order of Canada. He is currently counsel to Dorian Barton in his civil lawsuit against the Toronto Police Services and Toronto Police Services Board for their actions during the summit. So now I want to turn it over initially to John Sewell, and then who will all speak for 10 minutes. We'll watch their time, and then we'll take the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. I'm a member of the Toronto Police Accountability Coalition, and our group made a presentation to the G20 review panel 10 days ago, and my remarks are drawn from that presentation. And I want to make 3 points. The first is about the job that the police were doing. What a number of police officers have said since the G20 is, hey, our job was to protect the G20 leaders, and we did it. End of story. And in fact, I haven't heard any senior police person counter that kind of interpretation. But we know there were at least 3 other things that the police should have been doing. First of all, they should be upholding the Charter of Rights and Freedom. Clear thing. It's a good law in Canada. They should be upholding it. But as we know, they consistently broke it with illegal arrests and illegal searches of people. And they paid literally no attention to that. They had made no bones about the fact they didn't care about that particular law. Secondly, they should have been protecting people from violence. That's a job that we expect police to do. But in fact, in terms of the G20, virtually all of the violence that was caused to people was caused by the police. I don't think I've heard of an instance where anybody suffered any personal injury except because of police actions. And thirdly, they should have been protecting property from damage. That's another thing we asked police to do. But in fact, in this case, they clearly said they wouldn't. When in fact, merchants on Yonge Street found their windows being broken, they phoned police. The police literally said to them, "You're on your own. We aren't helping you." And in fact, they didn't. They didn't respond to those calls. So when it comes to the job that police were supposed to do, they had a simplistic attitude. Oh, we're just doing one thing, when in fact they should have been doing a whole bunch more. And it's clear that their managers and their civilian overseers did not tell them what was expected of them to do. It was a major failure on the part of the police service and in fact those in charge. The second point is that the role that police culture played. I think we're all aware of police culture, and when you get a whole bunch of police officers together, you get their culture coming out really strongly. It's a culture of solidarity, where they stand together against everybody else. It's a culture that involves violence, and they clearly go at people very easily. It's a culture which shows little respect for civilians and little respect for the niceties of law. And when in fact you get a whole bunch of police officers together, you really get that in spades. And we got that in the G20. And what's amazing is that nothing was done by police managers or those responsible for police oversight to counter this culture that we knew was going to exhibit itself. It was clear that, in fact, they were just allowed to do what they want and express their culture. And since the G20, I haven't heard any police leaders of any kind saying expressions of that culture are wrong and shouldn't happen. We haven't heard that. They seem to assume this is an appropriate thing for police to do. And the third point I wanted to make is the fact that there was no real civilian oversight. There's a big argument that happens about whether those responsible for civilian oversight should be looking at the way the police operate themselves. And, or whether, in fact, they should be staying away from that. The general interpretation is that, hey, we aren't responsible for any of the operational things police do. That's what they say. I happen to think that's an absolutely stupid position, but that's the one they take. The one thing they all agree on as people in positions of oversight is that they should be looking at money. But of course we know in regard to the G20, they didn't look at money. The figures, the CBC got all the figures about the contracts that were entered into with the various police forces across the country. And in fact, the average police officer who came to Toronto and worked in the G20 got paid anywhere between $3,000 and $7,000 a day. It's an astounding amount. And yet we haven't heard a single police chief anywhere across Canada say, that's an unreasonable contract for us to have entered into and to agree that this is what the officers would be paid. We haven't heard anybody in Ottawa say that, that this is wrong. In fact, we haven't heard anybody in a position of civilian oversight saying the way this money was spent was dead wrong. So we've obviously really seen something, and in my opinion, learned something out of the G20. These have been very clear lessons that we should learn. And I think most of us probably in this room have learned those lessons. And the question for us is, can we teach those who are in elected position those lessons so they start expressing them? That seems to be the challenge we face right now. Thank you.
Barbara?
Okay, thanks very much, and I am happy to be here to pinch hit for Hassan Yousaf, who can't be here. I want to be clear, though, that we cannot blame my lateness on Toronto traffic. It's not your fault. I was on a 2 o'clock flight leaving Ottawa, and it didn't leave Ottawa till 4 o'clock. So I did spend a lot of time sitting on the tarmac waiting for this flight to leave. And as I was sitting there, it did give me time to get my thoughts together, though. And I did think that it would have been faster for me to drive between Regina and Saskatoon, which is my home base. When people say, where are you from? I'm from Saskatchewan, but I live in Ontario right now. I was actually thinking about a year ago. And I was thinking that a year ago today, was International Public Service Day. And we were in Vancouver. It was the International Trade Union Confederation Congress, the first time held in Canada. And we were celebrating Public Service Day and about what we were standing up for. And we were anticipating what the weekend here and the rally and all of the things that people had worked for. And so that there was that whole sense that as Canadians, as citizens, we weren't just coming to Toronto to deliver a message to the world leaders and to our Prime Minister, but in fact there was a lot of international trade unionists in this country because of the Congress of the ITUC. So there was that extra special, I think, focus for us. And what was the message we wanted to deliver then? Well, we wanted to deliver the message that working people wanted decent jobs, that's how our communities would be best served. We wanted to deliver a message that we wanted and that we supported quality public services that worked for communities. We wanted to deliver a message that workers were not responsible for the economic and employment crisis that happened. We didn't create it. In fact, many of the things that we advised would have maybe blunted at least some of the edges of it, but in fact, it was not workers that created the problems that we were dealing with. And I was thinking on the plane today, you know, this whole thing about the reason that some corporations got bailed out and banks because they were too big to fail. Well, what happened to, you know, the 30 million people that lost their jobs in that time period? What happened to what if we used the same psychology on that and said letting those people lose all their jobs and decent wages would be too big to fail, that you had to actually do something about that? We had other messages as well. Before the G8, G20, many of our trade union members had been active in delivering messages about the access to HIV/AIDS medication around the world, and there had been a joining up of delivery of messages to embassies in Africa in particular, the Canadian embassies there. And the other part of it was we wanted to deliver a message about maternal health, because you'll recall that Stephen Harper was wanting to deliver a message about maternal health. We wanted to deliver one back that said maternal health includes decent jobs. Maternal health includes access to birth control. Maternal health includes access to abortion services. All of those sorts of things. So, you know, 34 million people officially unemployed, and many more because of being underemployed added to that number. The UN was predicting then that it would take 300 million new jobs to return to a pre-crisis situation, and that wasn't good for lots of countries as it was, and the global recovery was fragile. And we wanted to raise our voices as citizens. We thought that that was our right in this country to raise our voices, to say this is the message that we wanted to deliver. And we wanted to deliver that to international leaders, but to our Prime Minister as well. And we were engaged before all of this as well in the cases on the restrictions on the sonic cannons and so on. We had worked for months with local groups about having a People's March. And people first, we deserve better, you may recall, was the slogan. And so 30,000 citizens is the number that I've seen joined in the march. And it was a loud march, and it was a peaceful march. And it wasn't until many of us got back to the park that we found out that the police had actually rioted against the citizens. And that we have to remember that it was a police action against citizens. So when we think about that, we have to think about all of the things where the focus has been, but where are we 1 year later? What is the message that we can take from this? Well, as was pointed out, and as I was reading and reminding myself again today, that there was something like over 1,100 arrests or detainments, right? And I remember hearing just shortly after this that that was actually more than the War Measures Act. And that was the one that hit me, thinking about that and thinking, man, this was in one day. There was more action taken against people than in the War Measures Act. 317 people charged and 24 have been convicted, and there's questions about people agreeing to saying, well, I'm guilty, because that would be a slightly easier way to deal with it. No one has accepted responsibility for the police riot against the citizens. We don't have the independent inquiry that we've asked for and called for. And the $1 billion that was spent on personal security for the leaders, think about what it could have been spent on economic security for people in this country and around the world. What am I doing on time? Am I getting close? Okay. 3 more minutes. I've been on a race all day going sort of standing still, so I'm feeling like I need to keep on racing. Okay, so what do we also know is that the bankers and the chief executive officers have continued to do well. They didn't get particularly hurt through this. You know, there was some wringing of hands when some of them went from, $60 million paycheck to like a $55 million paycheck, and that was very difficult for their families. We didn't find them living under bridges, but, it was difficult for them. But they tended to come out of this quite well. Their jobs and their salaries were not affected. And we still see the amount of unemployment and underemployment that is in this country and around the world. And by the way, developing nations constantly remind us that yes, there was a crisis in 2008, but it was one of many for them, that it was just one more crisis that they were having to deal with. But there's a huge number of unemployed people, and the kinds of jobs that they're finding, as we know in this country, are not replacing the jobs that they lost. There is a massive attack on the public sector. I mean, we're not wearing buttons that say, I support CUPW, because there's nothing happening out there. There's a massive, massive attack on the public sector in all sorts of ways. And it's a signal that the Harper government wants to do more. And attacks on our pensions, things that people have fought for years, and things that people have bargained for. So those are all there. In the little bit of time in my closing, I just want to say that even having said all of that and talked about what happened in a very small way in a short period of time, am I cynical or do I despair? Neither of those. I had a friend of mine that told me many years ago that our enemies are not the corporate agenda, it's cynicism and despair. And so I guard against both of those. I think that there are events like this need to constantly remind the citizens that that we need to raise our voices, that we are very much alone if we only do it by ourselves, or if we stay silent. And that there are contradictions that can be pointed out. And this is my last point, and it gets back to the question of the police. I was reading the newspaper while I was waiting on the plane, and there was, you know, sometimes those short letters to the editor, or sometimes the ones that you read, and then you read it again, even though it's really short. And somebody wrote in and said, the young man that has been shamed in Vancouver, he's lost his position with the polo team and so on, he's at least come out and apologized. He's come out and owned up to what he did. And the letter said, so how come the Toronto police haven't yet owned up to what they did? And this 17-year-old kid has more moxie and more backbone than the police department does. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. Megan?
Two things struck me on the anniversary of the G20 on the theme of messages lost. And the first one was when I was thinking back over my history as an activist or as a protester, that in 10 years of protest on any theme or any issue, that I've just never been a person who wanted to chant en masse with anybody else. That every time somebody has yelled the question, what do we want? If I murmur, that's pretty great. You're not going to get much more than that out of me. But I've always been really confident while being on the streets that the communication of the message or the point of the protest would be so well done by the organizers that my purpose for being on the streets would just be simply understood by anybody who was around me. But this changed during the G20. During that weekend, anybody on the streets, whether out of curiosity or practicality or solidarity, I feel like their presence was fundamentally misunderstood by everybody who was around them. For the first time in my activist life, I shouted the reason for why I was on the streets that weekend, not to bring awareness to an issue, but to proclaim my right to protest. As was mentioned, I was arrested outside of the Eastern Detention Centre at about 2 in the morning on the Sunday, June 27th. I had spent the day legal observing for the Movement Defense Committee at the People's First March. And legal observing was just in order to ensure that other people's civil rights were upheld and to have a presence on the streets, hoping that that would chill anti-protest police action. At about 11:30, I was at home drinking and debriefing with friends when I got word that a very good friend of mine was likely arrested at the Novotel hotel. And so I chose to go down to the Eastern Detention Center and my poor friends chose to go with me, and fateful decision. And we arrived to the sidewalk outside of what I've heard is, I call it the Eastern Detention Center. I understand it's more properly called the Prisoner Processing Center, but that name is just really difficult for me. When we got there, there was a band playing, there was people dancing on the sidewalk, there was people exchanging information, but the police presence was growing. It was about 1:40 when we got an announcement from the organizer who told us that the police were going to read a proclamation in about 20 minutes telling us that we had to all go home. And I hope you can bleep this out, but I'll just never forget what he said. He said that there was no reason that we had to leave, that ours was a peaceful protest, and if they tried to take us, or when they tried to take us, we should just keep fucking dancing. But I knew my own limits, and I knew that I wanted to show solidarity from the outside without handcuffs on. And I danced my way to the edge of the crowd and waited for that proclamation to be read, fully intending to then hightail it home to be able to legally observe for the next day's protests. At the same time, the people around me were chanting, "This is not a riot, this is a dance party." At that point, the second announcement came, and they told us that some of the members of this protest were causing a breach of the peace, and that grounds for arrest existed. I should note that we were completely surrounded on all sides, and they said that they were going to arrest us and they were going to use force. And they said if we didn't leave, that the arrest would happen. People shouted back the obvious question, how do we get out? You've left us no way to leave. Eventually, they opened up a small exit so that we could disperse. I was towards the end of the dispersing group, as I did hang back to see what was going to happen to the people who chose to stay. In the end, no one chose to stay. We were about 1 to 2 blocks away when the slowest 40 or so of us were cut off a second time. It was very dark. I was facing a line of riot police, and they told us that they were going to arrest everyone. I became prisoner 1363 at that moment and was searched. And the first thing that they found was my Law Society ID, which was in my pants pocket. And it was game on for Mock the Lawyer. They were very pleased. They said that they didn't want to, or I didn't need to be read my rights. They said, announced to the crowd, oh, I've got a lawyer. So the other police thought that was kind of funny. They asked me not to sue them. I said I couldn't promise that. The fact that we were being, or subject to collective punishment was made apparent and explicit immediately. They said that if it hadn't been for the burning cars that day, that they wouldn't be treating us like this. They also said that we were going to be detained for a little while and we would be let go if we continued to act reasonably. We were then loaded back into wagons and driven 2 blocks back to the place where they had ordered me to disperse from. I was put into a cell with 5 other women. That was very, very cold. And to my shock at that moment, a guard walking past my cell recognized me. As was mentioned in my bio, I was a clerk at the Superior Court of Justice, and many of the security staff in the Prisoner Processing Center were in fact court security staff. The guards at 361 had long become accustomed to waving me through security, so I think it was a bit of a shock to then see me on the other side of the bars. He didn't stay long after he ascertained it was me. I was moved to a second cell. I was searched for a second time. This time they took my belt and my shoes. It was also very cold, but I got warm because it was very overcrowded. There's 38 women in that cell. And when I say 38 women, I like to remember and tell people that one of those women was a 17-year-old girl who had been picked up the night before. She'd been in there for hours. She'd been housed with adults. She hadn't been allowed to call her parents. And I asked to see a guard so I could explain that situation, thinking that this had been an oversight or a mistake. I talked to 4 guards before I demanded to see their supervisor, and the man laughed at me, and I had to laugh too because I was on the other side of bars. And when you're making demands, they're just not really that, it's not that easy anyways. I was still in handcuffs at this point, but I managed to slip out, free my hands, which was very, very big relief. There's another woman in that cell demanding her medication. She was on lithium, and she was ignored for hours. I was taken out of that cell, more paperwork was done. I was informed of my right to counsel, which was as of yet a very empty promise. And I was searched for a 3rd time. This time they took my bra. And I began wondering if there was many more searches, what else they would take, because I was running out of things to give them. In the third cage, it was about a 10 by 6. There was 10 women in there. We were very crowded because part of the floor was wet. Some of us were getting phone calls, some of us weren't. We were treated poorly in that cell, partially because my cellmates took up a chorus of Old MacDonald, and the only thing that Old MacDonald had on his farm was a pig. And they did not like that very much at all. In the fourth cell, I don't know how many women I was with because the number changed constantly. This was the cell that people were coming into and leaving from. This was the fourth time I was recognized by a guard, which I had to wonder what the other people in my cell thought, that I must have just been the worst narc in the history of the world. But the fourth guard I knew very well. He went completely white when he saw me. I had spent a long time on a long murder trial interacting with this man. He asked me why I was in there, and when I explained the entire story to him, I will never forget that he said, at the end of it, "I believe you." After hours of being in there and negotiating with these women for what we needed and deserved and had rights to, when I found him, I didn't have to argue anymore, and I was just able to ask for things. So finally, we were getting medical attention for people with migraine headaches, for injuries caused by the police on arrest, swelling, bruising. We were getting food for people who couldn't eat those infamous cheese sandwiches. And we were starting to get our phone calls. Meanwhile, I was attempting to try to give advice to some of the women experiencing panic attacks, but I myself was panicking at that point. But just as the moment that I thought I was going to completely lose it, one of the young women said to me, "Every time I look at you and I see that you're calm, I stay calm because you're a lawyer and you know what's going on." Which was the biggest lie I've ever heard. There was a woman who entered that, and I like to mention this too because there was some gender-based violence that happened in there. There was a woman that I met who had been walking towards Queen's Park who had a dust mask hanging from her pants pocket. And she told me, through a translator, she spoke no English at all, that she had been strip searched for this dust mask, which I find horrifying. I would like, in part of this, to just mention that these strip searches were a targeted way of terrorizing the people who were in there. I finally got my phone call about 20 hours into my experience, and I phoned my then boss, and who I like to call my lawyer, Murray Klippenstein. And then I was released about 40 minutes after that, about 21 hours after my arrest. I've said before that this experience has changed me. I'm still apprehensive at the sight of police. I spent ages afterwards helping friends find their friends, helping them find their belongings, trying to understand the system, trying to reach out to others, understand their legal recourses, and keep the faith. In the aftermath, many things were written about the condition of the cages, that there was poor lighting, that it was cold, that we couldn't sleep, that they were breaking our constitutional rights, we couldn't get medicine. But the shock of the experience to me was not how badly I was treated in that cage, but the fact that I was put in one, and for what. My personal experience of detention was one of extreme privilege. I'm mostly white, I'm middle class, I was arrested with my Law Society ID, I was with friends, I made new friends in there. I mean, in terms of going to jail, I don't think it gets much better than this. I don't know what it's like to live in a community where this experience is an everyday experience. But this is what struck me when I reflected on the theme of messages lost, how truly awful it still was. That one message that wasn't lost on us protesters was that we don't care about your voices. I feel incredible anger at the profound disrespect shown to the right to peaceful protest by citizens and police that have dismissed bright, motivated, engaged young people as troublemakers who should have stayed at home. And this is the saddest thing. One of the women in there, as a guard was passing by, said, "I get it. If you don't want me to go to a protest anymore, I won't. I just want out of here." And I hope that this was an isolated comment, and that these messages aren't the ones that are lost, but the future voices, these political promises, I hope that these aren't lost. Thanks.
I feel great shame for what my police force did to you, and I offer you my apology. Please accept it.
I'm concerned with accountability in the broadest sense this 1 year later. What we're seeing is government by sleight of hand. Let me explain what I mean. I have never before seen so many accountability measures offered and exercised to so little effect. Sleight of hand. Let me detail some of it for you. The Ombudsman of Ontario did an inquiry within his narrow jurisdiction. He looked at the way in which the Public Works Protection Act was passed and the scope of the regulation and the secrecy around it, which was a very useful thing to find out, that the secrecy was indeed deliberate. But it was such a narrow slice of the picture that it leaves us still with a substantial amount of ignorance. Mr. McMurtry, the former Chief Justice of Ontario, was commissioned to do a report. And his report was a very technical lawyer's report on the exact measure and whether the Public Works Protection Act was the appropriate legislation to use to effect these purposes. He concluded it was not. He was worried about the scope of the regulations and whether they violated the Charter. But it was all very legalese, and of course it had not much effect. The government has said, yes, we'll pass some other legislation, unspecified, unnamed, undated. So it sits. The Special Investigations Unit, which was established to look at cases of police wrongdoing and which has had its mandate substantially shrunk over the years, so that at the moment it covers only investigations into police use of force that result in serious bodily harm. Serious bodily harm is a very extreme form of use of force, resulting in harm of a very narrow type. And that means that, you know, they look at police shootings and things like that, but the average case of police brutality, the thousands of cases, are beyond their purview. They have no jurisdiction even to look at them. So what do? They start investigations. They can't investigate their way out of a paper hat. They can't find anybody. They close the investigation. Then they reopen the investigation again because the Toronto Star prints the story of the closing. They're embarrassed as more information gets drawn out. They can't find out who did it. None of the police officers will talk to them. Can you imagine? And so they close the investigation again, and then they start it again after the press gets on. I mean, I can stop there because you followed it. But in the end, they've laid 2 charges. 2. We all saw on TV hundreds of cases that should have been investigated. They are useless. There's the Police Complaints Bureau, Independent Review of Police Complaints, and they have produced so far absolutely nothing. Not a single charge laid against a single police officer, and they've had a year to fiddle about. Are we surprised? No, that agency, frankly, was designed to cover up police wrongdoing, to piece off the complainants before they can get to the public. Nothing happens. But that's an ongoing accountability measure. Just hasn't worked so far. Civil suits, and a lot of people have a lot of faith in civil suits. I'm a criminal lawyer and a constitutional lawyer, so I don't do many civil suits, unlike my colleague. But let me just tell you, I have very little faith in civil suits. We're doing the case of the clown, Mr. Veach, the English clown, who was arrested for being within 5 meters of the fence and for impersonating a peace officer. The evidence of what he did is clear. He pretended to be a member of a spy agency in the United Kingdom. And it wasn't until some months later that the Crown Attorney realized that was not a peace officer, let alone a Canadian peace officer, and of course all the charges were dropped. We represent Mr. Barton, who was the subject of the on-again, off-again, who's the officer in the glass mask. He wasn't even a demonstrator. He went down to, because the mayor invited people to go to Queen's Park where it would be safe and observe. And what happened, of course, was he wound up with a broken shoulder. The third case was Natalie Gray, that I have. And Natalie Gray was a young girl, protester, blue hair. Obviously that attracted some attention because she was seated in a kettled situation. And some police officer thought it was a good idea to fire 2 rubber bullets at her, and did, and hit her twice. The problem with suing is that you sue for money. And when you're a government that has things to hide, You settle these cases for money. So you pay out a couple $100,000 or $50,000 per case, and that's taxpayers' money, not their money, your money. City legal pays for it out of city taxes, and the cases go away. And they have to go away because if you don't take a reasonable settlement, you'll wind up paying all the court costs yourself. And that could be $50,000 to $100,000 quite easily. Lastly, the police get to investigate themselves, and we heard today about the response that they have. And I haven't read it yet, but I'm told the response was, we learned a lot. Well, I don't know how, since they've listened to no one who had a criticism of them, engaged in no dialogue. So what you're left with is the absence of any comprehensive accountability. As John put it, no government stands up and says, we're responsible. Everybody wants you to look the other way, and that's the role of the sleight of hand, to convince the public that something is indeed going on that's meaningful when it simply is not. Thank you.
Because I'm a journalist, I've got dozens of questions, but I'm going to open it up to you. There's a microphone over here, and I understand there's a handheld mic on this side. So please come and ask a question, and we'll go through as many as we can. Okay? Okay, we'll start over here, and I will alternate sides.
Yeah, I just, sorry, my name is Sid Ryan, President of the Ontario Federation of Labour. It is clear to us that the Harper government, beyond its social and fiscal conservative agenda, also have set about taking away civil liberties, clearly from the protesters, and at the same time we're seeing an attack in terms of the rights of workers around CAW strike with the airport, with the Air Canada, and of course today we're seeing the same thing happening in Parliament with respect to Canada Post. And it's a little bit reminiscent almost of Margaret Thatcher when she came into power. She went after trade unions and their ability to be able to marshal any kind of opposition to the government of the day. Ronald Reagan actually tried it with the air traffic controllers. And it appears to me to be at least an attack on the ability of the public to oppose the agenda. And I'm just wondering what the panel may think about the long-term impacts of any organisation in the public, or even the public at large, being able to mount any form of protest against the policies of the Harper government, whether it be civil liberties being suspended or collective bargaining rights being suspended. But anybody in society that has the ability to be able to take on this government, it appears to be that they're under attack. And I'm just wondering what kind of comments the panel might have on that.
Somebody want to take a crack at that? John, do you want to start?
Well, to me, I don't disagree with you. The Harper government's just, it's a real scary thing, what they're up to. But I find it very interesting that the G20 has had a big impact, actually, on people. People talk about it all the time. The police clearly have lost credibility. I see it most often in terms of what judges are saying about police. They're almost on a daily basis, you see some judge reporting, or being reported on, that in fact he doesn't believe what the police officer is saying under oath. I haven't heard that ever before, except since the G20. So I think that in fact the impact is quite broad in society. We haven't quite hit on the mechanism that's going to force the hand of a government at any level. I mean, you know, Toronto City Council voted 36-0 to say the Toronto Police had done a good job. I mean, thank you very much. So I think that's the impact, and what we have to do is keep talking about it, and something will arise. That's my hope. But I don't know what it's going to be at the moment, because I think it is very difficult. But that's sort of my optimistic view.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important point to raise, Sid, because that is also part of the strategy, is to make people think that there is no, either there is no point to go out and protest or to raise your voices, or that even when there are large peaceful protests, that something will happen. They will encourage people to say to their neighbors or to their kids or to their parents, don't go there because you don't know what will happen. And so I think that there is that we talk about chilling effect in lots of things. It is very much there to silence protest in every way that they can. So whether it's ending a strike by back to work legislation, whether it's saying, watch out, if you hit the streets, we're going to use the maximum police against you. You won't have any rights. Be aware that if you get thrown in jail for a while, that it will not be a pleasant experience. All of those sorts of things. So I think that there is that, and it's a matter of we sometimes look at other countries and say, how did they get to that point? How did it get to the point that people feel that they have no capacity anymore to protest? And we should look very closely at home, because that's what's happening. We're being constantly served up a message that, a number of years ago on the economics, it used to be there is no alternative. Well, they're trying to feed us now a dish that says there is no point.
I don't agree with the optimistic views that have been expressed. I think the sleight of hand is working. I think that government has learned at a number of levels in Canada that if you stonewall it and you prevent any investigations that are meaningful and you tough it out, that you succeed with the Canadian people. And I think the Canadian people are getting used to it. So, for example, I think when Chrétien canceled the Somalia inquiry, he got away with it. Clean and simple. And we just saw that with the prisoner treatment documents. The Harper government toughed it out, waited for the election, and have gotten away with it. The one bright spot in my analysis is the press. I talked to an acquaintance who's a journalist at the Globe and Mail, and he said, I know you've been talking to the Star. He says that the Star is doing a great job. I wish my newspaper printed the news. It's a quote. And,
have you on tape. We're going to use you in a commercial.
and a great compliment. Because as the institutions of government crumble under the pressure, some newspapers have not. And it's a real bright spot in a grim picture. The last comment is this. We're not doing this to win. And that's not why we're there, to be winners. We're doing it because it's right. And we'll keep on doing it.
Megan?
I just wanted to add something really quick, and it's that there's one thing that we have to remember when we're talking about the chilling of protest, and that there was another very large protest that happened that year on Parliament Hill, and it was an anti-abortion protest, and it was not over-policed to the same extent. And I understand that there weren't world leaders there that we were protecting, but the fact is that constantly protests on the left, I feel, experience greater crackdown.
Thank you. This mic.
Hi, my name's Nora. I work for the Canadian Federation of Students, and I'm also the editor of the Ryerson Free Press. I had the unfortunate situation of being hit by the police before a single window was smashed to the ground, and thankfully I was pulled out by the legal observing team and the street nurses. Now, my organization represents student unions in Toronto, and one of those student unions was the Graduate Student Union at the University of Toronto, which had its gym raided in a very famous raid during the G20 on the Sunday morning. And everyone in that gym was woken up at gunpoint, they were rounded up, and they were told to get into the trucks, and they were arrested. Now, just before that, we knew that our institutions were working with the police to either evict students or move students from residences to use those spaces for security services. And so I'm wondering if you've got any comments on the role that public institutions like universities, the University of Toronto, Ryerson University, in actually helping to make Toronto the police state and the oppressive monster that we saw during that weekend.
Okay. Someone want to start on that one? Megan, you want to take a crack at it, seeing you were...
Well, I did meet some of those young students that were roused from the gym. And I understand where you're coming from in that you want to look to your school and your institution to protect the voice of civil liberties. I do feel that there should be some recourse towards these things, as we're increasingly seeing schools crack down on student voices. And I'm thinking of the various silenced demonstrations and or protests. I don't have an answer to that, but I do recognize that it's an increasing problem in our institutions.
Okay, I'll come up here.
My name's... Is it on? Yeah. My name's Bruce Fox. I'm with Greenpeace. And originally I wanted to ask your impression about the intimidation factor of the police show of force in the lead up, actually, to the G20. But then, in fact, Barbara Byers touched upon it there somewhat, that in fact a pretty strong message went out to people. Greenpeace was quite aware early on that we were under surveillance by the police force. And the purpose of that, it was so ham-fisted, was in fact to try and send a message of don't do anything. And I think that had a big spillover effect for a lot of people. We heard it in the review over the last couple of weeks that the Police Services Board did of people who said, I simply stayed away from it. I guess my question then would be at this point is whether people did have comment around intimidation, but perhaps more importantly is how do we break through to the public that this was a serious breach of a number of charter rights, of freedoms that is basically a decreasing democratic space that we get to operate in. How do we break through to the average Canadian in Mississauga that, you know, this is a legitimate form of expression?
Barb, do you want to start with that?
I do. I think it's about telling the stories of Megan, you know, in lots of ways, because when, for example, when a labor leader gets up and talks about it, whether or not they've been arrested, people automatically think that we were wrong anyhow. No, that's not fair, but there is somewhat of a stereotype. But I do think it's about, I mean, think about the stories that have impacted on you in the last year. And they have been, when you've seen stories like yours. I remember seeing a story of a couple that were at the one where it was raining and the police just moved in. They'd been there all night. They were, I was going to say an older couple, but I think I'm of that age now too. So, but you know, I mean, so I think it's about saying this isn't about some other group of people. This is about your next door neighbors, you know, and it is bringing that reality back to people. I think that has already been pointed out. This isn't about going to court or whatever it is to win. It's to do something because it's right, but it's also to create some change, some pushback, because every time they take away one more right, it just feeds that with people to say there is no point.
Okay. John, do you want to add to that?
Well, I mean, just to say it again, my impression is that people do understand, and our problem is trying to find the mechanism that allows people to speak out. I believe that there's more interest now in policing than I've ever seen in the last 10 years, but people have some problems about figuring out what you do about it. So I think we have to think in those terms. So what small little actions do we do that might be something else? I don't disagree. The more stories we can tell, the better, and the more movies we can have about it and films, the better. But I think that it'll be a continuing issue that's going to be talked about for the next 3 or 4 years. I personally believe that people are going to keep at it and at it and at it, and we've got to find the right little thing, and we haven't found it yet.
Okay, I'll come to this microphone.
My name is Lila Gary. I was not involved in the protest, but I've been involved ever since in various discussions and fora. And I have a question about what to do, because on one side we have a cowardice and corruption in both elected and non-elected officials, and on the other side we have a complacent and risk-aversive public. And unfortunately, the end result is doing nothing other than discussion. So I was wondering if all these organizations that they have been involved in this fiasco, why not organize with a timeline a referendum? Because I don't think that the public inquiry will take place. I think they will avoid it to the end until elections come again, and that will be forgotten. And I don't think this issue should be talked to death.
So could you just rephrase the question then? You want a referendum of?
Yeah, if all the organizations that they have been involved so far, all you people plus so many other organizations, get together, collaborate on a referendum, public referendum. Unfortunately, we don't have a recall in our government electoral system to recall the bad products, just like industry does. But since we don't have recall, why not a referendum? And that way the public will get involved and do something and force the government to come forward. Otherwise, they will forever avoid action.
Okay.
It's a good thought, but there's no law allowing for referendum in Ontario, so the only thing you can do is pressure the Ontario government into giving you a referendum. If they won't give you a royal commission where they get to pick the commissioner, hand pick him, then they're certainly not going to give us a referendum. So it's a good thought, but I can't see it happening.
But this is, it cannot happen in Ontario. Can it happen national? Well,
same situation,
same
no legislation. But a nice try.
Thank you. Come over to this side again.
My question is for John Sewell. As you stated, the only thing the police have acknowledged to date is that their primary concern was protecting the G20 Summit. Now, as we know, the Black Bloc or whomever went about their merry way for at least an hour or more. The police simply stood there doing nothing, and then suddenly around 5 o'clock, an hour and a half later, the police, suddenly there were enough police found. They started to crack down at that point. But for about an hour and a half, nothing happened, while the damage was being done along Yonge Street, Bay Street, and along College. Now, my question to you is, do you think there was a calculated decision by the commanding officers to do nothing, to virtually allow the violence to occur, on the proposition that perhaps the violence would justify the crackdown, which perhaps the police felt they would necessarily have to engage in, and also conveniently allowing the government a rationale for having spent the $1 billion on security, because now they could say, well, look, there was the violence. And of course, everybody knew the violence was coming anyway.
Well, I certainly think that that's one possible explanation. I know that John Morden, who's doing this G20 review for the Toronto Police Services Board, has specifically been asked to find out what the police strategy was in respect to that violence. So maybe there'll be some answers there. Maybe what we'll find is that someone will be able to show that a couple of police officers were members of the Black Bloc, right? I mean, a good old thing they've done in Quebec for a long, long time. And why wouldn't they do it here? Might as well learn from. But I suspect that we're going to get a lot more information on that. I mean, back to my point, these issues are not going away, and so I think sooner or later we'll find an answer to that. Maybe we'll actually be in a position of being able to corner Bill Blair and force him to start telling us the truth about what really happened and why he did the kinds of things that he did. I suspect that might happen at some point.
Clay?
We may just find that the answer to the phenomenon you're talking about is stupidity. we know, because we've been on demonstrations a lot, that people who are intent on violence, like the Black Bloc, infiltrate the peaceful demonstrators, and that's where they hide until the moment when they're going to do violence. I suspect the police didn't really have that dawn on them, but rather they conceptualized it as our forces and their forces, two sides. And they thought militarily to confine our forces so their forces could have control. It may just be that that model, that way of thinking, is what got them into the stupidity.
Megan?
I just wanted to say that I used to also have that same wondering how this was allowed to happen, what was going on, until I saw what happened in Vancouver and the police again stood back. The interesting part, though, if you're going to compare those two, and I hate to use the word riots, was what happened to everybody else around. In Vancouver, when the police stood back and let it happen, they didn't then arrest 1,000 people afterwards. In fact, they came out and said, we're not going to punish everybody for the actions of a few.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely a protester, as you can see from my T-shirt. I think there was a large contingent of protesters there speaking on environmental issues. And 1 week before the summit, I had sent an email saying, let them eat oil, which is, as you know, it was raining oil in Louisiana then, so I thought that's appropriate. And surprisingly, within 24 hours, I had 2 cops at my home. Now, I knew something was cooking by then, 1 week before. My question to you all is, today I'm almost tempted to send another email, since all of us are sharing the Fukushima hot particles in our lungs now, that let them eat radioactive waste. What is the guarantee that I won't have 2 police officers show up at my home again? So I really would like to know what is the status of police showing up at your home for sending an email.
Clay, do you want to tackle that one?
The police have a right to show up at anyone's home and knock on the door and say, can I talk to you? And if you want to talk to them, have a nice time, that's their right. There's nothing wrong with it. What worries you from a public policy point of view is the stupidity of it in many of these cases. The notion that you can spot a terrorist by chatting with them at the door. I mean, think about it for a second. It's just silly. But it's a lot of manpower and it's expensive, and it's one example of how police don't understand in these contexts the people they're policing and trying presumably to protect or should be protecting.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Just one more comment.
Quick.
Yeah. I grew up in a country where bananas grow, and I want Clayton to take up the responsibility for the Apple Republic.
I missed it. But I'll take responsibility for whatever it is.
Apple Republic, that's all.
Okay. Way up here.
Hi, thanks. My name's Anna Willits, and I was one of the people who helped to organize a number of the events during the lead up to the G20. And I wanted to pick up on the discussion of violence and the police use of violence. I think what the use of police violence really successfully did was, and I don't know if it's on purpose or not, and I'm not sure if it's directed from the government or not, but it very successfully obscures the messages that people are trying to bring, the very legitimate messages that Barb was talking about, and the attention to the conditions that people around the world are living in and in the host country. And I think although everybody remembers all about the police violence, no one remembers what was decided at that meeting, what arrangements were being made by those leaders during a time of terrible suffering for people, and the austerity measures that probably got agreed upon while we were fighting with the police. Police violence has been a tactic that has been used for all time in all protests. The bath raids 30 years ago had police provocateurs at the front, but particularly in Toronto since the June 15th, 2001 demo with OCAP on the lawn of Queen's Park, and also I think OPSU also dealt with some very awful violence from the police under Mr. Fantino. We have seen that every protest on the left has been met with this kind of over-the-top, seemingly undirected very sleight of hand. I absolutely agree. And I do think our eyes are being purposely averted. I think that sometimes that people, unfortunately, involved in the protest aid and abet it. But my frustration leading up, I took part in several media conferences, was the way the media worked with the police to create this hysteria and this focus on violence that hadn't happened yet. We were trying to make really important points about things that women needed, racialized people needed, immigrants and refugees needed. We were trying to make these points at media conferences, and the only question we got back constantly was, do you agree with the use of violence as a tactic? No violence had occurred at this point. And we could not get media to talk about anything else. And this aided and abetted the police, in my opinion, and created a situation where people felt cynical before the thing started and were dissuaded from coming down. I'd love to hear your comments on that.
Barb?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even as we're talking tonight, again, it's that thing, the thing of the message we were trying to deliver about what the economic and employment crisis had done to people, the need for decent jobs, the need for maternal health, I mean, the whole list, the environment, all of the things that people wanted to deliver a message to leaders about did get submerged. And it got submerged. It's interesting when you take a look at how different things have happened. I remember I was out at Montebello when the famous agents provocateurs from the SQ were there. Well, even with that, even though that was a pretty important event that we actually caught these guys, you know, being agents provocateurs on tape, all of those sorts of things, the message at Montebello got lost, because that's what we ended up concentrating on. And similarly here, the same thing happened, that there is but interesting as a contrast as well, in 2002, when we were in Calgary around the G8, and there was a lot of, again, work with the local police and with a lot of community groups, and there was a lot of work done on the demonstrations that were there. What we were told by some of the media people was, well, these aren't very exciting marches. Like, you know, and I understand. I mean, I understand that people are my husband is an ex-reporter, and he says to me, Barb, you know, the story isn't about when dog bites man, it's when man bites dog. I mean, you have to have the unusual. So, but quite clearly, people were told, at that point in 2002, well, we just won't be coming and covering these the same way if there's no news. And well, the news is the story about people losing jobs. The news is the story about maternal health. The news is the story about people trying to defend their lives and their livelihoods. All of those sorts of things. And again, I think we have to turn our minds to how do we creatively get those stories there, and how do we work with people in the media who many of them were also caught up in what happened and saw it. I want to can I give one funny example though, because we talk about the Black Bloc or the anarchists or whatever words you want to use. And there were several times during the march, and I was right behind the young women who had the very large coat hanger, and then there was the first banner, and so there was a group of us that were right there, a group of women. And these young people every once in a while would come charging up the sidewalks beside us, and we'd start chanting at them, "The women lead the march! The women lead the march!" And they all backed off. I mean, they just disappeared. They were. It was one of those moments that you say, they heard us quite clearly. And ever since my experience in Montebello, I've spent years advising people to watch out for agents provocateurs. And until I went through the Montebello experience, it was suddenly, okay, now I really get it. That, yes, it really is a reality. And I look at Toronto and say, how many?
Your question on the media is a whole panel by itself. television, I think you were referring to. Take this question.
Hi, my name is François Villeneuve. I just want to make a short testimonial to parallel what Megan said before going on to my question. But I was also a G20 detainee, and in one of the cells I was detained in, there were quite a few young men who had come to Toronto from the periphery of the GTA, Peterborough, London, and a few other places, who got detained as well, who came to see the protests and came to see what happened. And I mean, Megan, you talked about how this one woman said that she would promise not to protest again, just let her out. These young men were like, we're never coming to Toronto ever again. You know, like they were like, wow, this is Toronto, but we're not having any of it. You know, like it really made a strong impact on people. You know, because I mean, I'm an activist, I'm a protester, but I didn't care that much actually about the G20 protests. I came down anyways, and I was never intending on doing anything for being arrested. I mean, I had been in Quebec City in 2001, and you know, nothing bad had happened nothing legally bad happened to most people there, although there was plenty of tear gas. So anyway, on to my question actually for Bob. So you've been in the Middle East and reporting from there, and we know that Canada has a security partnership with Israel, and in particular, Toronto Police has been trained by some people from Israeli police and or IDF. And I'm wondering from the protests that we had here for the G20 and the police response to protests, if there's any differences or similarities that kind of struck you from how IDF or Israeli police or even police forces elsewhere in the Middle East respond to large protests like we've had here at a G20?
I think the police forces all around the world work together, and so it's not just Israel, but Toronto police get advice from Britain, Australia, United States, everywhere. So I think it's sort of a bit unfair to pinpoint one country where they pick up practices and techniques. Let me just say that throughout the Middle East, the violence that you saw in Toronto is nothing. Next question over here. Do we have one here?
My name is Steve Ruchinsky. I was one of the people who was at Eastern Avenue when the riot squad attacked people there. I was also at Parkdale where they kettled everyone on the street, and anyone who was going in any direction was stopped and stood in the rain for hours on end until they were searched and ID'd. I think that what happened on the G20, I mean, the individual police who were responsible for the acts of violence that were committed against people, there needs to be redress for this, in the sense that you can't commit crimes against people and just turn around.
Okay. Do you want to try it again?
Again, and what's happened since then, that there's really a need for an inquiry as to who was in charge, what's going on. In the Ombudsman's report, the OPP, who were part of the coordinating committee, said they knew that the legislation that was being invoked, about the fence and the 5-meter act, that it wasn't constitutionally sound, that it was illegal. They knew that. To just put the blame, like, what role did Bill Blair play? What's his involvement? What's his leadership? Let's get to the bottom of that. People need to know that. But what was the role of the RCMP? What was the role of the OPP? What was the role of other police forces that were created to manage this? The federal government created a body to manage this whole thing. And it's like there was an article a couple of days ago in the Sun, I think, about the RCMP skulked away. Well, the whole federal government has skulked away and takes no responsibility. It created an agency to oversee this, and it's under that authority that our rights were violated. So this has to be addressed. So I'd like your opinions on it, because it's not just Bill Blair.
Okay. Clay, do you want to start?
I think I echo what you say, and I agree with you. But we're back where we began. There's no accountability. Our government is not functioning in a way that's responsible. Our job is to try and change that, but I'm not optimistic we're going to find that tool very quickly.
John?
And of course, here I am, I'm optimistic. We do have a provincial election coming up in 3 or 4 months. My impression is that a lot of people in this room, among others, are going to be asking all sorts of people, so where's the inquiry? And I believe that, in fact, we can raise that enough times with enough candidates to actually try and make it so it's somewhere there in among the election. I think that that's one opportunity. As I've said, I don't know what the right thing is that's going to turn things over, but I think that if we keep pushing away, we're going to find it. It'll, as usual, big changes like this come upon us by surprise. So if we keep working at it, and I think that that provincial election is an opportunity to keep raising it and saying, where are you, what are you doing on it?
We were going to finish up around 8 o'clock, so I'm going to but it'll take a few more questions over here.
I want to point out that this kind of action on the part of the police is not really new. I've been around long enough to know that it happened back in the first Depression, or the first large Depression in the late 30s. Now, of course, there were things that happened this time that were even worse, and the number of people affected was larger. And therefore, but the problem that I see is the way that the thing that was raised earlier, that there's the culture of the police in the way that they cooperate so much together that they don't get the information from outside. And it seems to me that, as Mariana Valverde said on Monday night at a meeting that I was at, that it has to do partly with the way that they are selected off and put into a training situation where they rely on one another much more than an ordinary person going to university and getting some education does. And it seems to me that that's what creates the military sort of aspect that there is in the police. And we don't really need that in the police in the same that you may need it in soldiers, people going on a military expedition to some other place.
So your question is?
So my question is that I'm asking if changing that system is one of the ways that we can prevent this thing that happened where they grab everybody and it puts instead of looking for the individuals who have done a particular thing that they need to deal with.
Okay. Clay, do you want to talk?
Yes, of course. Changing the way that they select police officers or police chiefs or police managers is critical to try and changing the police. Just as going after their money and trying to say, sorry, you got to do with a lot less money will also change police.
Quick question over here.
Hi, Tim McGuire with QP Local 79 here in the City of Toronto. I want to return a little bit to the discussion earlier because we've talked a lot about civil liberties. We haven't talked a lot about the messaging loss. It's important to talk about civil liberties, but in terms of the messaging loss, I went to the demonstration, and the vast majority of people went on the march to counter what was happening at the G20 and other institutions around making people pay off of Wall Street, making other people pay for the crisis. And we're told in Canada we're doing okay compared to other jurisdictions in terms of the austerity measures and the cutbacks that are coming. So that message was lost. So in terms of lessons learned, there are interests in terms of keeping that message from getting out. So I want to delve into that a little bit. I know we don't have much more time, but Those interests don't want that message to get out, and it happens time and time again. That message seems to get out when the media is reporting on European situation, for instance, whether it be Greece or Britain. There is protests, but the media seems to report to us that those protests are happening to counter austerity. But we don't seem to be hearing that message back to us here. So in terms of lessons learned, what lessons have been learned in terms of policing? And I'm from labor, so maybe in an introspective way, Barb. What lessons have we learned in terms of ensuring those interests that want to stop that message from getting out are countered? Those interests could be a number of people. It could be the Black Bloc, other folks, it could be the police. But going forward, one, what lessons are learned from G20 in terms of making sure that in the future people's messages get out in terms of countering austerity messages, austerity measures moving forward, and how do we get that message out now that that's what this is about? It's important to talk about civil liberties, but also to continue that this is about countering those interests.
Okay, Barb, and then I'm going to take one more question on this side.
I mean, I think both yourself and the previous person and others have raised it, is that we have to keep coming back to what was the G20 supposed to be, the discussions were about, and what was it the message that we were trying to raise. And we should remember that Stephen Harper was wanting to use the G20 as a place to promote more austerity, more privatization, more cutbacks, all of those sorts of things. And he got to, as you, I think, have dealt with, he really got to bury his message in there quite effectively, and we were concentrating on other things. What do we have to do? We have to keep coming back to the message. It's not unlike, in some respects, when people are on picket lines and people say, well, what are you out there for? Well, we're out there for a lot of things, but we're not out there just because we like walking on a picket line either. We're out there because we're trying to do something about not just our wages, but the wages of our communities, not just our pensions, but the pensions of our neighbors, all of those sorts of things. I think we have a responsibility to do much more outreach, because labor is often the first and the last line of defense for a lot of people that will never hold a union card right now because they don't have that chance.
And this will be the last questioner.
Okay, John, on terms of the actions of the police and the spending, Marlene Jennings is getting the RTMP to investigate the spending. The G20 in Pittsburgh cost about $18 million. And recently in France, when they had the G8, it cost about 24 million euros. So I think the spending in Canada for our G8 and 20 was rather excessive, and maybe there's a reason why they call them pigs. For Clayton, in terms of civil liberties, what would the direction be, since Rob Ford's a right-wing mayor who's kind of slow and Harper's got a majority, and provincially we're trending towards a HUDAC minority government? Like, what would the implications be to organize protests in front of Queen's Park, City Hall, and other federal buildings? Because if people are intimidated, then how do they go about organizing if there's a surveillance and so forth going on? Thanks.
I think we're in a bad time, and that things are going to get worse. But I look around the room and there are a few gray hairs, and things have been worse. And the answer is you just keep on demonstrating. You keep on talking. You keep on struggling. You do not give up. And eventually you'll find that people do care. Governments do react eventually. And that's what we should do. It's not going to be easy. This is not a time that welcomes the protest. This is not a government that pretends to listen. Probably doesn't listen at all, either level. Certainly not Toronto, certainly not federally. But our job is different. Our job is to keep on talking the truth. And eventually, I have confidence the truth will, in fact, make things better.
Okay. John?
My impression is this is the largest meeting I've been to in the last 10 years to talk about anything related to police. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Now, I agree we've been through an awful experience, but as others have said, police have acted generally in this way for quite some time. They seem to have gone over a line which has made a lot of people very, very concerned. That to me is the optimism, and that's the thing we've got to build on, and individually we've got to keep raising it and pushing it, and I think that's the way we're going to find the device that in fact makes a very serious change in this situation.
I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank Barbara Byers, Megan Daniel, Clayton Ruby, John Sewell, and I think some of them will be willing to talk to you for a few minutes afterwards. Anyway, thank you again for coming. Thank you. It's been great.
And just before everyone leaves, I'm Graham Norton from the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. I'll take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists as well and remind you about the G20 Redux event that we have coming up on Saturday at 2 p.m. at Queen's Park, so come out for that if you can. Thank you to the CLC for their help with tonight's event, and the Asper Centre as well. And one last reminder, be sure to take your garbage with you tonight. Thanks very much for coming out. Have a great night.